The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency Luis Guillermo Solís Rivera, President of the Republic of Costa Rica. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Luis Guillermo Solís Rivera, President of the Republic of Costa Rica, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President Mogens Lykketoft, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Costa Rica would like to congratulate you, sir, on your election as President of the General Assembly. I reiterate my country's commitment to work with you, as we do with all member states, to achieve the goals that we have set for this session, and also to strengthen global governance and multilateralism. Mr. President, with showing great judgment, you have suggested that we focus this debate on the celebration of the 70th anniversary of this organization, and especially on the relationship between peace, security, and human rights. The intensity and the seriousness of the events leading up to this meeting make this discussion both timely and urgent. There are millions of human beings who are living in a starless night. Their pain, their despair, and their anguish test the deepest fibers of our own humanity. In the clutch of circumstance from which nobody escapes, let us demonstrate that the sun of a new era of our civilization is rising and not setting. Therefore, instead of simply repeating the same rhetorical exercise, the rhetorical exercise into which we fall every year and every decade, instead of repeating what we all already know, Costa Rica believes that it must be the General Assembly that makes a call to action and translates what has only been words into deeds. There should be consistency between what is said and what is done. We are not prisoners of fate, but rather the shapers of fate. Our actions matter. This must be the General Assembly that triggers the processes we have long awaited, one that leaves behind indifference, one that embraces solidarity with renewed passion and commitment. This must be the General Assembly that shows that although we are a community of nations, we are also much more than the sum of our individual interests. This must be the General Assembly that consolidates the United Nations leadership as a center of global governance. Leadership an organization that continues to engage in reforms that will make it a more effective, efficient, robust, proactive, and dynamic organization. To that end, let us begin by electing the person who will occupy the position of the Secretary General of this organization in a more democratic manner. Since 1946, the process for selecting the person who will hold the most important position in the international community has been characterized by its opaque nature. Costa Rica is determined to change that. Along with Estonia, my country is leading the efforts of almost 30 states to establish a process that is transparent, democratic, equitable, inclusive, and one that, unlike today, would be consistent with the Charter of the United Nations and similar high-level international processes. Costa Rica is proud to have included in the resolution that was adopted just a few weeks ago an invitation to member states to put forward women candidates for the position of Secretary General. The time has come for the position of Secretary General to be occupied by a woman. Let us acknowledge the great capacity, competence, and commitment of women in all areas. Let us send an unequivocal political signal that, as we commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, that this organization stands by what it preaches in terms of equality and empowerment of women and girls. To consolidate the United Nations position at the center of global governance, the Security Council should assume its responsibilities with regard to maintaining international peace and security. It should take into account human rights considerations in its actions and improve its work in conflict prevention. The Council's focus on conflict prevention is inadequate, and when it does take action, that action often comes too late. I say this because of Libya, Mali, the Central African Republic, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, and Yemen. I say this because of acts of sexual violence and gender-based violence perpetrated against girls and boys, women and men in Iraq, Syria, and northeastern Nigeria. I am referring to the genocides in Rwanda, Srebrenica, and to the tolerance that has been shown for violations constantly committed against many peoples, including the people of Palestine, and against racial, ethnic, or sexual minorities in other parts of the world, including the West. I also say this because of the millions of Syrians who have been displaced in historic proportions, or the thousands more who continue to risk their lives at sea to escape death in the form of chemical weapons, barrel bombs, and cluster munitions, the use of which is categorically condemned by Costa Rica. None of these crises emerged without prior warning. They developed over years and sometimes decades of offenses against human dignity and human rights. They were perpetrated by deficient or corrupt governments and institutions, which engaged in acts of repression, discrimination, and exclusion, acts that eventually restricted fundamental freedoms, deprived people of their economic, social, and cultural rights, exacerbated disparities in development, and disrespected the right of the peoples of the world, including the right of the people of Israel to live within secure borders. The primary responsibility of promoting, protecting, and fulfilling people's rights and fundamental freedoms rests with states. However, when governments fail to meet their responsibility to protect, either because they lack the will or the ability to safeguard the rights of their own people, then it is up to the international community, and in particular the Security Council, to intervene and to deploy the wide variety of resources and tools at its disposal to resolve conflict. Despite having those resources, we did not do enough to prevent this human tragedy. We did not do what was necessary to stop thousands from venturing out into the sea with their own children. For the United Nations to consolidate itself as the center of global governance, respect for and promotion of human rights cannot be subject to manipulation. We must be very cautious of the attempts of some states to manipulate the purposes and principles of the Charter in an effort to prevent the United Nations from tackling the worldwide challenges for which it was conceived to resolve. We must be very cautious of the need to effectively defend the rights of the people. And some try to distort the purposes and principles of the Charter by affirming, for example, that human rights violations are not related in any way to the maintenance of international peace and security, or that sovereignty precludes the commitment of this organization to such issues. Sovereignty, a concept associated with the birth of the nation-state, should no longer be used as an excuse for the international community to sit back and be a silent witness to a bloody theater. The less we consider sovereignty as a wall or as a shield, the more likely we will be able to fulfill our responsibility of protecting the civilian population. In the words of the Secretary General, and I quote, "Early action to prevent conflict and protect human rights helps to strengthen sovereignty rather than challenge or restrict it," close quote. Thus, not a single country may hide behind the wall of sovereignty and silence when serious violations of human rights are perpetrated. No crime against humanity should go unpunished. Therefore, Costa Rica reaffirms its support for the proposal of the Secretary General, known as Rights Up Front, which places human rights issues at the heart of United Nations efforts. It is an attempt to correct the systemic failures of the past, as the initiative recognizes that these violations are indeed early warning signs of coming crises. Because human lives are at stake, Costa Rica supports France's proposal to restrict the veto in the case of mass atrocities. This proposal dates back to our membership in the Small Five and also dates back to the efforts spearheaded by Liechtenstein in the Accountability, Coherence, and Transparency Group, ACT. That group has made efforts to adopt a code of conduct in order for permanent members of the Security Council to refrain from using the veto in situations of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and to demand a political commitment to act promptly and decisively in such situations. The opinion of a single permanent member cannot continue to bear more weight than the necessity to save lives. When a permanent member uses or threatens to use the veto in those circumstances, they abandon and publicly disregard the right of victims to justice and peace. They undermine international efforts to put an end to impunity. The veto breaches the trust that millions of people have vested in the United Nations as their last hope. We all agree on the importance of strengthening the rule of law to consolidate the institutions that protect the civilian population, to address the root causes of conflicts, to promote accountability, and to combat impunity, both nationally and internationally. It is no coincidence, then, that the rule of law has a key place in the 2030 Development Agenda. However, only one permanent member of the Security Council acknowledges the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, and only 2 have ratified the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Costa Rica calls upon all states to adhere to and to implement international instruments for the protection of human rights and the fight against impunity in the face of atrocious crimes. Once again, we call on all states to ratify the Rome Statute with its amendments as adopted in Kampala in 2010. The more multipolar our world, the more we must rely on the rule of law at the international level. The commitment to maintain international peace and security is also reaffirmed by all permanent members of the Security Council. However, at the same time, they are the largest producers and exporters of conventional weapons in the world. The serious issue with this is that despite the explicit prohibitions in the Arms Trade Treaty, these countries continue to conduct international arms transfers, including small and light weapons, and these arms transfers are being made to conflict areas in the world. The explicit prohibitions on transfers of conventional arms contained in the treaty exist to prevent human suffering and to save lives. They are not there to be ignored. Costa Rica calls on the states that have signed the Arms Trade Treaty to ratify it, and on those who have ratified it to work without delay for its full and effective implementation. Furthermore, nuclear weapon states, including the permanent members of the Security Council, have violated their unequivocal commitment to nuclear disarmament in the light of Article 6 of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. They argue that the current security setting is not suitable for nuclear disarmament, and they cling to the traditional paradigm of state security that keeps 16,000 nuclear warheads in the world, many on high alert and susceptible to cyber attacks.
No es condicional ni es opcional.
Compliance with Article 6 is not conditional or optional. It is mandatory. Nuclear disarmament cannot be postponed any further. The fact that 115 states have signed the humanitarian pledge demonstrates the conviction of the international community to place nuclear weapons on an equal footing with other weapons of mass destruction, weapons that are prohibited under specific treaties. Costa Rica calls for more states to endorse the humanitarian pledge and to fill the legal gap to prohibit and eliminate the nuclear threat once and for all. Placing the United Nations at the center of global governance is not limited exclusively to improving the work of the Security Council or to strengthening its role in conflict prevention. It also implies a greater strengthening of the General Assembly and the organization as a whole. Thus, our efforts must go further. Let us focus our attention and our resources on reassessing the third pillar, that of human rights. In terms of human rights, the United Nations has fostered significant policy development, even extending border protection to cover an increasing number of vulnerable groups, such as children, persons with disabilities, the elderly, migrants, and indigenous peoples. However, although the principles and obligations are clear and there is an institutional structure with deliberative and executive bodies, the situation on the ground in many parts of the world is far from where we would like it to be. In addition, the allocation of resources is not consistent with statements that have been made and other declarations. The promotion and defense of human rights cannot continue to be limited to rhetoric. On the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, gender equality and the empowerment of women must cease to be merely words in many regions of the world. They must translate into congruent and consistent commitments to that declaration, incorporating national public policies that will truly bring us closer to the goals outlined in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. That development agenda has a mainstreamed and gendered approach that takes into account the considerations of women in each of its objectives, goals, and indicators. Therefore, the major challenges facing multilateralism require a more effective and efficient governance structure in order to ensure respect for and observance and progressive development of human rights. It is crucial that we create opportunities for the effective participation of non-governmental stakeholders. We must enhance regional structures for the implementation of the global agenda. Above all, it is essential to create better budget provisions to strengthen the institutional framework. As of now, the third pillar of the United Nations receives only 3% of the regular institutional budget. Let us adjust our regulatory framework and institutional actions in human rights so that the Human Rights Council, the system of human rights treaties, and the Security Council, among others, may better synchronize their efforts. The challenge is to ensure that we act as a single organization, effectively and coherently, and not in an awkward and fragmented manner, and to protect and promote the rights of people, including the right to development. This was demonstrated during the entire negotiating process that led to the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In that process, Costa Rica shared its experience in conservation, environmental protection, unilateral disarmament, and leadership in the transformation towards a model of sustainable development. And it will again be demonstrated when we reach a landmark agreement on climate change in Paris at the end of this year, as climate change constitutes a serious threat to human development. Costa Rica firmly believes that as we look towards Paris, we need a serious, binding, and people-centered commitment that respects human rights and that involves comprehensive climate action, not only by governments, but also by various economic and social sectors. I wish to especially commend the leadership of President François Hollande and the support of President Barack Obama in the process of launching his Clean Energy Plan. We must also take advantage of the opportunities arising from international cooperation, particularly as regards the means of implementation to facilitate the participation of all countries in global efforts, and particularly middle-income countries. Our country has launched the Geneva Pledge for Human Rights and Climate Action. This is a voluntary initiative that is based on the acknowledgement of the relationship between the enjoyment of human rights on one hand and the impact and consequences of climate change on the other. Costa Rica calls upon all states to adhere to the Geneva Pledge for Human Rights and Climate Action. Mr. President, the divorce between words and deeds only builds distrust and erodes multilateralism. Costa Rica refuses to accept this state of affairs, which undermines the authority of the United Nations and places us in a situation of great vulnerability in the face of both old and new threats. It makes this much-needed organization lose legitimacy among its member states and the international community as a whole. For those reasons, this must be the General Assembly in which we claim that we, the peoples of the world, desire and are able to live in peace, freedom, equality, justice, democracy, and with opportunities to create, to believe, and to grow. Following the words of the leader of Cuban independence, José Martí. Martí's words resonate today more than ever. Mr. President, terrorism, organized crime, drug trafficking, and worldwide pandemics are proof that threats to a nation's security are no longer limited to traditional borders. Transnational threats must be addressed collectively. The violations of the most basic human rights, above all the right to life, perpetrated by terrorists and other so-called non-state actors, as well as the dreadful events that have taken place in areas affected by the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, against women and girls and other vulnerable groups, pose a serious threat to international peace and security. Costa Rica strongly and unequivocally condemns terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, regardless of the perpetrator or the purposes. In the face of human tragedy, of what are still uncertain ramifications that are caused by the displacement of civilians fleeing violence, Costa Rica reiterates the importance of seeking a global and integrated approach, one based on solidarity, that addresses this critical situation promptly and that can be sustained over time. History has shown that better results are achieved when cooperation is given precedence above confrontation, when tolerance is placed above terrorism, and when ideas are placed above radical ideologies. In the fight against terrorism, Costa Rica is concerned about the use of sexual violence as a terror tactic and the link of violent extremism to exercise control over women's autonomy, as well as the impact on and the restriction of their rights. We are distressed by the growing use of armed drones outside of conflict zones and the reinterpretation by several governments of human rights and humanitarian principles. For my country, it is urgent that we take action to better understand these matters and to address all of their implications. It is here at the United Nations, through the existing disarmament bodies, where we must begin to adopt measures to increase transparency and ensure accountability in their use. Mr. President, in commemoration of the 70th anniversary of this organization, let us make the United Nations a more robust, dynamic, and energetic organization, which, rather than debating abstract concepts, seeks to find practical and specific solutions. Let us start by electing the first woman as Secretary General and by ensuring that this is an inclusive, transparent, and equitable process that will allow us to have a visionary, independent, and strong leader who will be the first to react, direct, and act on the most pressing of challenges and crises facing humanity. Let us urge the permanent members of the Security Council to provide coherence and consistency in rule of law and international law, arms control, and nuclear disarmament. To give just a few examples, the Security Council is an integral component of global governance, and its legitimacy depends on the consistency of its actions. Let us all work on strengthening the General Assembly and its bodies to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the entire organization. Let us protect innocent civilians who are deliberately targeted and who are victims of unspeakable crimes of sexual violence, victims of attacks with chemical weapons, cluster munitions, armed drones, and barrel bombs. Sovereignty does not protect and cannot allow the protection of governments that commit atrocities against their own people. Let us put an end to impunity and support efforts to engage and adopt a code of conduct that prevents the use of the veto in cases of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Let us fight together against terrorism, which is spreading like wildfire and which increasingly threatens international peace and security, human rights, and sustainable development. And let us do so while we strictly observe international law, including human rights standards, international humanitarian law, and international refugee law. A self-serving reinterpretation of these standards is a danger that cannot be overstated, especially when it is wrongly used to justify unilateral solutions. Action must always be taken multilaterally. Let us work tirelessly, without any excuses, in favor of a culture of peace. Laterally. Let us work tirelessly, without any excuses, in favor of a culture of peace. As host to the University for Peace on its 35th anniversary, Costa Rica calls upon all states to support it and provide it with the necessary resources to fulfill its important duty of educating the leaders that our world needs in the prevention and resolution of conflicts and in the promotion of long-lasting peace. In commemoration of the 70th anniversary, let us remember the importance of keeping our doors open to new realities, to civil society, to non-governmental organizations, and to women. Our doors should be open to youth, who we should engage to promote reconciliation and sustainable peace. Doors should be open to suggestions of groups such as the Elders. They should be open to collaboration among United Nations agencies. For what is necessary is to provide holistic responses to the challenges we face. Our doors should be open to regional and sub-regional organizations that also play a crucial role in conflict prevention and management. And our doors should be open to all people and individuals, to their ideas, their dreams, and aspirations, open to change and prepared to act. Costa Rican poet Jorge de Bravo once said that humankind has ascended through the ages up an endless ramp of progress. It would appear that sometimes we have regressed, yet we have only stopped to affirm ourselves. 70 years on the scale of history is just a sigh in the wind. However, measured instead by lives saved, agreements reached, and progress made in finding common solutions to the world's deepest and most serious crises, the passage of these 70 years begins to feel monumental. It is extraordinary what we can accomplish when we stand together and act in a united manner. My closing words today are optimistic ones, and in that regard, I would echo Master Poet de Bravo, who said, and I quote, "The world is moving towards an era of love and brotherhood. Misery shall disappear from the face of the earth. Equal rights and opportunities shall prevail, despite those who struggle to enslave others. Come join me in the fight, brothers, for what must come will come sooner if our arms are pushing the mills of history." Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
On behalf of